students, welcome to our YouTube channel. Today we are going to study about another concept related to communication. We're going to study about the contexts that are there in communication. So there are several contexts and questions are asked. So they give you a huge statement and you need to find out which context they are talking about. So let us talk about all of these contexts. Finding the answer would be easy for you then. So what is basically context in communication? Let us see that. What is context? So context in communication basically refers to the environment or the setting in which the communication is taking place. What is communication? You are talking to someone, you are exchanging facts, figures, symbols. This exchange is called as communication. So communication takes place always in a given context at a given point of time, and that is called as the context of communication. So context of communication refers to the environment or the setting in which communication takes place, which includes various elements like there are participants, there is the physical setting, there is the psychological environment, and there is a cultural backdrop that is relevant. So for every communication, there is always a few things behind it. And what are these? These are the participants that are there. This can be the physical state, it can be the physiological, or psychological state, then it can be the cultural background. Each type and instant of communication will have a specific context, and they will always give you what? In the paper, they'll give you statements. For example, Ram is talking to Sita at this point of time. So there can be a huge statement and they can ask which type of context they are talking about. Let us see the first context, that's the historical context. So the historical context involves the expectation of the speakers and the audience in situation that happened regularly or have happened in the past. So if there is a situation or a communication that happened in the past, we call it as the historical context of communication. Then we have the psychological context. So as we know, the word psyche shows that it is related to your mind. So this context will be related to the mind. The psychological context refers to the mood or the emotions of the audience. Now this is of course because psychological communication and finding about the psychological barriers is one thing that is very important, often asked in the paper, and it is difficult also because your mood changes, your perception changes, the psyche changes. So this becomes a difficult thing to ponder about. But anyway, what is the psychological context? It actually refers to the mood at that given time or the emotion of the audience at the given time, as well as the speaker to the lesser context, right? How the audience is feeling will have an impact on how the speaker's message will be received and how they should be delivered. So the emotions of both the speaker as well as the receiver are very important. If I am trying to communicate with other person and I'm not in a good mood, then of course there can be, I'm not fit for communication at that time, and there can be trophies in between. If the other person is not that happy or maybe not in a good mood, he or she can perceive my message in a very wrong manner. So these are the barriers that will always come up, and that mood about which we are talking, or the setting or the emotions that the audience or the speaker holds, it is called as the psychological barrier. Then comes the cultural context. So the culture relates to the beliefs and the values of a group of people. So at what time you are talking, that is the temporal context. If you're talking about the past, it becomes the historical context, and if you are talking about your psyche or your mood, it becomes your psychological. And if you talk about beliefs and values of a group of people, it becomes the cultural related context. It is always critically important that a speaker understands the cultural expectations of the audience as well. So sender and receiver should understand the cultural context as well. There needs to be two topics that needs to be discussed in under the cultural context are the high context culture and the low context culture. In previous exams, they have asked about it. So let us talk about these two types of contexts related to culture. High context culture. High context culture relies heavily on implicit communication and non-verbal cues, which with the meaning often embedded in the social context. Whereas the low context culture emphasizes explicit communication, where meaning is primarily delivered from the speaker in the written form or in the spoken form. This means that the high culture is that culture which values the non-verbal communication also. So in communication, we have two types of communication that are very important, the verbal as well as the non-verbal. The verbal are those kinds of communication where you use words, where it can be either spoken or it can be written. So the words become more important rather than looking at the meaning behind it. So the denotative meanings are more important. So if you're talking to someone and you are angry, the words that you are talking are more, that you are speaking become more important. The underlying meaning and the context that you are referring to is not paid heed. That is what? That is the high context culture. So in high context culture, you have the implicit communication and the non-verbal cues that become important. So in high culture, you will look at the non-verbal cues that are there in between, and you will look at the implicit meaning that is attached to it, right? That is often attached to the social context also. Whereas in the low context culture, you have a very, the meaning is directly given to you. The denotative meaning is more important, not the connotative meaning. It is primarily delivered either as a spoken manner or in the written words. So quickly let us revise. High context culture will value the non-verbal communication, will value the non-verbal cues in between, and the low context culture will only look at the words that you are using. That means verbal communication or the verbal cues are more important here. So where is India? Is India a high context culture or a low context culture? India is definitely a high context culture, because in our country, in our culture, we pay a lot of focus to the non-verbal cues attached to communication as well. Symbols and cues are also important for us. Then comes the social context. The social context is a personal matter of that person. So when they are talking about their personal matters, it becomes the social context. It involves the relationship of the speaker with the audience and the expectations involved in that relationship. So if you must have, if you're talking to someone, there is a bond, there is a relationship that is maintained. And if you are talking about those things, those personal matters and the relationship between you, that is the social context. Then comes the physical context. There is always a time and place for everything, and that is where the physical context comes into picture. The physical context involves the actual location and the time of the day, the lighting, the noise level, or the related factors to it. So if you are talking to someone and there is a lot of noise, at that time, what is the context we are talking to? You're not able to understand the things because there is too much noise. That is the physical context they are talking about. In fact, the noise is also a physical barrier that is there in between. Then comes the temporal context. The temporal context is related to the timing when the message is delivered or the sequence of the events that are important. What is a temporal context? It encompasses the timing of the message that is delivered or the sequence in which the message is delivered, right? That is the temporal context. Let us quickly revise all of these contexts. So what is basically a context? Context refers to the environment or the setting in which communication is taking place. We look at various elements like participants, we look at the physical setting, psychological environment, and the cultural background. It is different for different people at different contexts. Historical context is when you're talking about expectations of the speaker and the audience according to the situations that regularly happen or happened in the past. That's historical. Then comes the psychological. It is related to the mood and the emotions of the audience. When you talk about culture, it is related to the cultural beliefs and values of the group of people. High culture means you give a lot of value to the non-verbal cues, and low culture means that you are primarily talking about the denotative meaning, the direct meaning. Then comes the social context where relationships come into picture. There is the personal level bond that is there in between the speaker and the audience. That is important. The physical context refers to the actual location, the time, etc. that are involved, and the temporal context encompasses how the message is delivered, the timing of the message, and the sequence of the events, right? So I hope you understood this context, this concept, that what is the context that are there in the communication. If you have any doubt, you can ask me that in the comment section and I'll surely reply to you. Thank you.